For centuries, Europe told one story about the Sami, latecomers, primitive nomads who wandered in from somewhere else and clung to the frozen edge of the continent, herding reindeer across ground nobody else wanted. Outsiders to the nations that grew up around them. That is what the textbooks said. That is what the schools taught. And it was wrong. Because in the last few years, ancient DNA pulled from a burial on a reindeer island in the Russian Arctic, and from the bones of people drowned in a blood-red lake in Finland, has begun taking that story apart. Here's the question Europe never wanted to answer. If the Sami were the outsiders, why does their DNA carry the oldest signature on the continent and a second thread that runs east into Siberia? The secret was never that they came from somewhere else. The secret is what happened next. To understand why the Sami story is so threatening, you first have to understand the story Europe chose to tell in its place. And for most of the last 2 centuries, that story was simple. The Sami were a people on the margin. They lived where no one else wanted to live, in the tundra and the birch forest above the line where farming stops, herding reindeer across a landscape that looked to outsiders like the end of the world. They had their own language, unrelated to Norwegian or Swedish. They had their own dress, their own songs, their own gods. And to the nations rising up around them in the 1800s, all of that distinctiveness was not a heritage to be protected. It was a problem to be solved. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia were busy becoming modern states. They wanted unified populations, single languages, clean borders drawn on a map. The Sami, scattered across all 4 countries and belonging fully to none of them, did not fit that vision. So the dominant societies decided what the Sami were. They were backward. They were nomads who had drifted in from elsewhere. They were, in the language of the time, a more primitive people, destined to be absorbed or left behind. The land the Sami had stewarded for thousands of years was claimed without their consent, and the people themselves were pushed to the edge of their own history. And here is where the official account begins to feel thin. Because when geneticists finally turned their instruments on the Sami, they did not find a people who fit anywhere on the European map. They found the opposite. In study after study, the Sami emerged as what researchers themselves began to call extreme genetic outliers among European populations. Not slightly different, not a regional variation on their Scandinavian neighbours. Outliers. A population whose genetic signature stood apart from almost everyone around them in a way that demanded an explanation the textbooks had never offered. Think about what that word actually means in the mouth of a scientist. An outlier is the data point that does not belong, the result that refuses to sit on the line with the others. For a population to be called an outlier across an entire continent, something in its past has to be genuinely unusual. And the Sami were not outliers in one direction. That is the detail that makes this story so strange. They were pulled in 2 directions at once. Part of their inheritance reached deeper into Europe than almost any living people on the continent, and part of it reached east across thousands of kilometers toward Siberian. For most of the 20th century, the academic world had no way to measure any of this. The tools did not exist. So the question of where the Sami truly came from was answered the way uncomfortable questions usually are, with assumption dressed up as fact. They were latecomers because it was convenient to call them latecomers. They were outsiders because the nations around them needed them to be. But assumption is not evidence, and the moment the science caught up, the convenient story started to come apart in the hands of the people telling it. Because the answer to where the Sami came from was not one answer, it was 2, and they pointed in opposite directions across the map of the ancient world. To follow the first of them, you have to go back to the ice itself, to the oldest thread in all of Europe. Begin at the ice. Around 11,000 years ago, the great sheets that had buried northern Europe under a kilometer of frozen weight began to pull back. They had ground the land flat, scoured it down to bare rock, and held it lifeless for longer than human memory can reach. And as they retreated north, they opened something. A raw, new country of meltwater and bare stone and slowly returning forest, empty of people and full of game. The reindeer moved into it first, and behind the reindeer came the hunters. These were not farmers. Farming did not yet exist anywhere near this part of the world. These were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people who lived entirely by what they could track, trap, and gather, following the herds across the thawing ground exactly as their descendants would follow them for the next 10,000 years. They left almost nothing behind that survives. No cities, no monuments, no writing. But they left something more durable than any of those things. They left their DNA in the bodies of the people who came after them. And that is where the first half of the Sami secret is written. Because the maternal line of the Sami, the genetic signature passed down unbroken from mother to daughter, belongs to one of the oldest lineages in all of Europe. Geneticists call it haplogroup U5. It is a Mesolithic marker, a direct molecular link to those first hunter-gatherers who walked into the empty north behind the retreating ice. It is found in ancient European remains, tens of thousands of years old. And within it sits a subtype so concentrated in one people that researchers gave it a name. They call it the Sami motif. Let that detail settle. Among the Sami, this single maternal lineage and one other account for roughly 90% of the entire female line. In some Sami groups, the Sami motif alone exceeds 40% of the population. There is no comparable concentration anywhere else in Europe. Across most of the continent, this ancient hunter-gatherer signature was diluted almost to nothing, overwritten by the great waves of migration that came later, the farmers out of the Near East, the herders off the steppe. Those waves swept across Europe and replaced what they found. They did not reach far enough or stay long enough to overwrite the North. So here is the irony that should stop you cold. The people Europe dismissed as latecomers, as outsiders who wandered in from somewhere else, carry on their maternal side the deepest, oldest, most distinctly European signature of any living population on the continent. Older than the farmers. Older than the people who built the megaliths. Older, by far, than the nations that would one day call the Sami foreign. If ancestral presence on European soil counted for anything, the Sami had the strongest claim of all, and they were told they had none. There is one further detail, and honest science cannot leave it out. Faint traces of the same maternal motif turn up far outside Scandinavia in scattered populations as distant as North Africa. Geneticists are still working out what that means, whether it marks an ancient dispersal in one direction or a return migration in the other. It is a loose thread, and it has not yet been tied off. But the maternal line is only one half of the answer. It explains the depth. It explains the continuity. It does not explain the word outlier, because something else is woven into the Sami genome, and it did not come from the ice. It came from the East. The East announces itself on a small island in the Russian Arctic. It sits in a cold bay off the Kola Peninsula, a scrap of rock and tundra that the people who once lived there called, in effect, the Great Reindeer Island. Its name today is Bolshoi Oleni Ostrov, and buried in its ground was a cemetery, an ancient burial place of a people whose culture has no name we know, who left their dead in the earth roughly 3,500 years ago and then vanished from the record entirely. For most of the time since, those bones could tell us almost nothing. Then, in 2018, an international team did something that had never been done before in this corner of the world. They recovered genome-wide ancient DNA from 6 of the individuals buried on that island. It was the first time the deep genetic past of the region had been read directly, not guessed at from the living, but pulled straight out of people who died before the Trojan War. And what they found changed the shape of the whole question. The 6 islanders carried a kind of ancestry that did not belong to Europe. It was Siberian. Specifically, it resembled the genetic profile of peoples still living far to the east, in the Arctic heart of Siberia, populations like the Eng-Anasan. This was not a faint trace. It made up a substantial share of who these people were. And it had arrived in the far north at the latest around 4,000 years ago, carried west across an almost unimaginable distance of taiga and tundra. The older hunter-gatherers of Scandinavia, the people of the ice and the reindeer, did not have it. Something or someone had brought it in from the other side of the continent. It came down the male line above all. The Sami carry a Y chromosome lineage called N1C, a paternal signature passed from father to son that traces a long migration out of Siberia into the European north. It is common among the Finno-Ugric-speaking peoples. It is rare among the Swedes and Norwegians, whose paternal lines belong overwhelmingly to the older Western European groups, labeled I1 and R1A. On the map of European fatherhood, the Sami stood somewhere the textbooks had no category for. Now hold the two halves together, and the word outlier finally makes sense. On the maternal side, the deepest hunter-gatherer signature in Europe, rooted in the ice 10,000 years ago. On the paternal side, a current that ran west out of Siberia 3,000 to 4,000 years later. The Sami were never one people from one place. They were the meeting point of 2 ancient worlds, a crossroads written into a single genome, the oldest of Europe fused with the farthest reach of the East. That is the secret the textbooks could not hold, because the textbooks only had room for one origin, and the Sami had 2. And the island gave up more than ancestry. Locked in those same ancient genomes were specific genetic variants you would expect to find far to the east, markers tied to traits like tooth shape and the structure of hair, and others linked to how the body processes fat. They were sitting there in people buried on an Arctic island 3,500 years ago, which means the fusion was already complete by then. The crossroads was old even when those islanders were alive. But a fused inheritance is not the same as a survivable one. To live where the Sami lived, the body itself had to change. And it did. Consider what the Arctic actually demands of a body. Months of darkness. Cold that kills the unprepared in hours. A land where the things that grow in gentler places, the grains and the fruit and the green abundance of the south, simply do not exist for most of the year. To live there, generation after generation, a people cannot rely on willpower and warm clothing alone. The body has to be rebuilt from the inside, and the Sami genome carries the marks of exactly that rebuilding. Start with food. In a warmer world, the human body runs largely on carbohydrates, on bread and grain and plant sugars. The Sami had almost none of that. Their calories came from fish hauled out of freezing water and from the reindeer that were the center of everything, animals that gave them meat and fat and the means to survive. A diet that heavy in animal fat would strain many populations. But the Sami carry variants in a set of genes that govern how the body processes fatty acids. The genes researchers label FADS1 and FADS2. These variants fine-tune the system for a life lived on fat and protein rather than plants. The diet did not just shape their culture, it reached into the genome and adjusted the machinery. Then there is a marker carried west from the east, the same eastern current that ran through the island in the Arctic. It is a variant in a gene that influences traits as ordinary as the shape of teeth and the structure of hair, a variant found at high frequency in the peoples of East Asia and in Native American populations, and far more rarely in Western Europe. Its presence in the Sami is one more thread tying them to that long migration out of Siberia, written not in a record or a story, but in the body itself. Here, a careful line has to be drawn. There are further claims, repeated often, that the Sami body produces heat in unusual ways, that it carries more of the specialized tissue that burns fuel directly into warmth, that it endures cold more easily than the bodies of southern peoples. These ideas are plausible. Some studies point toward them, but they have not been settled with the same confidence as the genetics of diet and ancestry, and an honest account has to hold them loosely, as suggestion rather than fact. The strong evidence is in the lineages and the fat processing genes. The rest is still being measured. And then there is the quiet force that preserved all of it. A population on the edge of the habitable world is, by definition, a small one. The Sami passed through bottlenecks, periods when their numbers fell so far that only a handful of lineages survived to carry the people forward. Normally, a bottleneck is a wound. It strips away genetic variety, narrows the inheritance to a few surviving threads. But here it did something else as well. Combined with thousands of years of isolation in the far north, it held the Sami signature in place. The ancient maternal line, the eastern paternal current, the markers of cold and diet, all of it was concentrated and locked down rather than diluted away. The Arctic kept them rare, and rarity kept them whole. There is a place in western Finland called Levanluhta, and for a long time it was simply a strange local mystery. A small body of water where, century after century, human bones kept rising out of the mud. The water there is rich in iron, and the iron had done two things. It had stained the lake a deep, unsettling red, and it had preserved what lay at the bottom, holding the bones of the dead against the rot that would have erased them anywhere else. People had been laid in that water during the Iron Age, roughly 1,500 years ago, in southern Finland, far below the line where anyone expected to find what the science eventually found. Because when researchers recovered ancient DNA from the people buried in that red lake, the result did not match the country they were dug out of. These were not the genetic ancestors of the modern Finns who live in that region today. The individuals in Levanluhta were closer, genetically, to the modern Sami. People with a Sami-like signature were living and dying in southern Finland 15 centuries ago, in a place that is now thoroughly, unquestionably Finnish. Stop and consider what that overturns. The whole official story rested on the idea that the Sami belonged to the far north, that the Arctic edge was simply where they had always been, a marginal people in a marginal place. The lake says otherwise. It says that the ancestors of the Sami, or people closely related to them, once held ground far to the south of the territory they occupy today. The far north was not their natural and only home. It was where they ended up. And the lake does not stand alone. The land itself remembers them in its names. Across southern and central Finland, researchers have traced place names whose roots reach back not to Finnish, but to Sami languages, the names of lakes and hills and rivers laid down by Sami-speaking people and then inherited unknowingly by those who came after. The linguistic map and the genetic map tell the same story. Sami-related people and Sami speech once stretched across a vast sweep of the region, deep into the south, long before the borders and the nations that now define it existed. So what happened to them? Not, for the most part, a sudden conquest. Something slower and in its way more complete. Early Finnish-speaking populations moved into the region and grew, generation by generation, until they demographically overwhelmed the people already there. The older population was absorbed, displaced, pushed steadily northward as the newcomers became the majority and their language became the language of the land. The Sami did not vanish. They were edged out of their own south, compressed into the Arctic remnant, where Europe would later find them and call that remnant their natural place. This is the heart of the secret, and it is darker than any question of where a people came from. The Sami were not outsiders who wandered in from the margin. They were a people who lost the center. They held the oldest maternal line in Europe and a reach that ran from the Arctic deep into the southern forests, and over the centuries that reach was taken from them, until all that remained was the frozen edge and a story written by the people who had taken the rest. The lake did not just redraw a map, it exposed a theft, and it raises the last question. If the truth was lying at the bottom of the lake all along, why did it take so long to come up? The answer is not only scientific, it is political, and it is uncomfortable. And it begins with the fact that the truth about the Sami was inconvenient to powerful people for a very long time. Think about what the emerging nations of the North needed to believe. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia were building themselves into modern states across the 18 and 1900s. And a modern state likes a clean story about who belongs and who came first. A people with the oldest maternal line in Europe, a people who once held ground deep into the south before being pushed to the Arctic edge, did not fit that story. They contradicted it. To admit that the Sami had been there first and over a far wider territory was to admit that the land had been taken. It was far more convenient to insist that the Sami were latecomers, primitives, outsiders who had drifted in and clung on. The marginal story justified the marginal treatment, and the treatment was not abstract. It was carried out on children. Across Scandinavia, beginning in the 1800s, governments pursued policies designed to dissolve the Sami into the dominant population. Children were taken from their homes and placed in boarding schools where their language was forbidden. They were punished, physically and psychologically, for speaking the words their mothers had taught them. A people who carried the deepest inheritance on the continent were made ashamed of the one thing that marked them as themselves. The aim was not to study the Sami past, it was to erase the Sami future. And a society working that hard to silence a people has no interest in discovering that the people were there first. Then there is the simpler matter of the tools. Even setting the politics aside, the science that finally cracked this open did not exist for most of the time that the question was being asked. You cannot read genome-wide ancient DNA without technology that matured only in the last 15 years or so. The bones in the Red Lake were lying there the whole time, but no one could question them directly. The cemetery on the Arctic island held its answer for 3,500 years before anyone could extract it. The verdicts that branded the Sami as outsiders were reached with the instruments of a century ago, and they were never retested because retesting them was impossible until very recently. It is possible now, and the map is being redrawn. The genome says the maternal line reaches back to the hunter-gatherers who followed the ice. The island says an eastern current ran west out of Siberia and fused with that line thousands of years ago. The Red Lake says Sami-related people once held the south. The place names say their words were spoken across a country that has forgotten it ever spoke them. None of these threads on its own would be enough to overturn a settled story, but they do not stand on their own. They converge from genetics and archaeology and language all at once on a single conclusion the old account cannot survive. The Sami were never who Europe said they were. Not latecomers, not outsiders, not a primitive people on the natural edge of the world. They were the meeting place of two ancient currents, holders of the oldest thread on the continent, and the rightful inhabitants of far more than the frozen remnant left to them. Europe knew enough to take the land. It simply preferred not to know the rest. So the secret was never where they came from. It was carried in a maternal line older than Europe's first farmers. It was buried with 6 people on a reindeer island in the Arctic. It rose century after century from the red water of a lake in the south, and it was beaten out of children for speaking the words their mothers gave them. The Sami were never the latecomers Europe needed them to be. They were the meeting place of 2 ancient worlds, holding the deepest thread on the continent, while the continent wrote them out of its own story. And the story is not finished. The ice sea is still retreating. The lakes still hold their dead. Somewhere right now, another ancient genome is being read for the first time, and the map that Europe drew is still being torn up, one buried truth at a time.